Louisiana Lawsuit Abuse Watch and the Coalition for Common Sense work together to ensure lawsuit fairness for all Louisianians. From individuals to small business owners, we represent over 10,000 supporters all across the state who are dedicated to improving the state's legal climate. Lawsuit abuse is when you have individuals and lawyers who take advantage of the legal system for their own personal gain. And it's unfortunately a problem in Louisiana because when you have lawsuit abuse in the system, meritless and frivolous suits can clog up our courts and actually take away precious time and resources from legitimate cases. Furthermore, it also increases costs for individuals through higher insurance premiums, and ultimately it can discourage jobs and investments, the investment of jobs and economic development in our state.
What have you seen as far as an impact on jobs in Louisiana from companies that are affected?
Sure. Economists estimate that frivolous litigation costs Louisiana about 50,000 jobs every year, and that by improving our state's legal climate, we can continue to strengthen Louisiana's economy and create lots more jobs, keep Louisiana moving forward.
My name's Jim Harris, and I'm very honored to be here on behalf of Coalition for Common Sense and Louisiana Lawsuit Abuse Watch. It's our pleasure to welcome you to the 2015 Gubernatorial Forum on Lawsuit Reform. As part of our mission to improve Louisiana's legal climate, CCS and L-Law invited all 4 gubernatorial candidates to participate in this hour-long discussion, and we're very honored that 2 of them are here this morning. Lieutenant Governor Jay Darden and U.S. Senator David Vitter have joined us for the discussion. Gentlemen, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I would like also to recognize State Representative Neil Abramson, who is here with us today. Representative Abramson serves as chairman of the House Civil Law and Procedure Committee. He's worked tirelessly over the last several years, bringing together all sides in this debate with the goal of making our civil justice system better. Neil, thank you for your leadership in that area. Also like to recognize and thank our friends with the Louisiana Lawsuit Abuse Fairness Committee who are sponsoring lunch today. We appreciate your efforts, and they're in several different areas of the room. Now, despite some modest reforms in recent years, the perception that Louisiana has one of the most litigious legal environments in the country persists. In recent years, the U.S. Chamber Institute for Legal Reform has consistently ranked Louisiana's lawsuit climate as 49th out of 50 states. At the same time, the Center for Public Integrity gave Louisiana an F for judicial accountability. And the American Tort Reform Association has singled out Louisiana as a judicial hellhole for 5 years running. Many Louisiana voters tend to agree with these assessments. A poll conducted last year found 72% of Louisiana voters believe there are too many lawyers filing frivolous lawsuits in our state. And 76% said state laws need to be strengthened to limit lawsuit abuse. Indeed, citizens from all walks of life recognize that our state's dysfunctional court system overwhelmingly benefits a select group of well-connected lawyers, a very few at the expense of everyone else. In order to overcome these challenges, it's our hope that significant legal reforms will be considered in the 2016 legislative sessions to ensure access to fair and impartial courts. Joining us today to moderate this discussion with the gubernatorial candidates is my good friend and colleague, Chuck McMains. Now, as many of you know, Chuck's been around a while. Like me, he's an ancient. Chuck is a former state representative who authored and helped pass a package of major reforms during Governor Mike Foster's administration, including legislation that repealed punitive damages, strict liability, and joint and several liability. He also authored a comprehensive revision of Louisiana's class action articles and helped stop the rise of mass tort litigation. Chuck now serves as special counsel with the Jones Walker Law Firm, so please join me in welcoming him to his moderating role.
Thank you, Jim, and thank all of you for attending today. I'm very honored to be able to moderate this important discussion and to share the stage with these gubernatorial candidates who are both good friends and who have both dedicated their lives to public service. The format for our discussion today is very straightforward. We will begin with brief opening statements from the candidates. Then the candidates will be asked a series of questions regarding lawsuit reform. The questions were provided to the candidates in advance and reflect priorities identified by CCS and LLAW supporters and members through a survey conducted earlier this year. A copy of the survey results are included in your folders. Each candidate will be given 3 minutes to respond to the questions. The order of speakers will begin in alphabetical order and then rotate with each question. Following the question and answer segment, we will conclude with the candidate's closing remarks. First of all will be Jay Darden. Jay currently serves as Louisiana's Lieutenant Governor, a position to which he was reelected in 2011. He previously served 1 year in that position, following an unexpired term. He also served 4 years as Secretary of State and 15 years as a state senator. During his legislative service, he chaired the Senate Finance Committee. In 2003, he was named National Republican Legislator of the Year. Prior to being elected to the state Senate, Jay also served as a member of the East Baton Rouge Parish Metro Council. He's an active community volunteer. He has hosted the Jerry Lewis Telethon for the Muscular Dystrophy Association for more than 30 years. He is an attorney, a graduate of Baton Rouge High School, Louisiana State University, and LSU Law Center. He is married to the former Kathy McDonald. They have 2 sons, John and Matthew. Please join me in welcoming Jay Darden. Jay, your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Chuck, and thanks to all of you for being here today. I know many of you in the room, and it's nice to have an opportunity to visit with you. I want to welcome Senator Vitter for a cameo appearance at one of these forums. He occasionally makes 1 or 2, and I'm glad that he's here today with us. If there had been an invocation today, it might have been one similar to one I jokingly say you hear at the Bar Association luncheon. It goes like this: "Stir up much strife amongst thy people, Lord, lest thy servant perish." And I know most all of you are here because you think that's all too true across America and also in Louisiana, and I'm happy to have the opportunity today to answer some of the questions you have about where we ought to go in Louisiana, what we can do to improve our business climate. I've only missed one of the forums that we've had since the beginning of this campaign. It was very, very early this year, probably in February, and I've made every other one. I think it's important for candidates to answer questions and go to hostile audiences as well as friendly audiences. And I don't consider you a hostile audience, but I think it's appropriate for all candidates in a race for governor to be willing to answer any and all questions that people have to pose for them. I think I have a unique perspective in this race, but also this morning. I've practiced law here in Baton Rouge since I graduated from law school, clerked for federal judge Frank Palazzolo for a couple of years, and then joined the firm that became Kennan, Odom & Darden. I've done a little bit of everything in my career. I've represented plaintiffs who have been injured. I started off representing insurance companies doing defense work. I've spent most of my time in my legal practice before my statewide election as a mediator. So I've been in a position where I see both sides of cases. I understand what drives discussions regarding settlement. I understand the problems that we have in Louisiana from a very practical standpoint when it comes to lawsuits and how they affect society and how individual claimants and really defendants as well have to deal with situations. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about what I intend to do as governor on a couple of things, because I know we'll be talking about the specifics that you're interested in the questions. I intend to be the most accessible governor Louisiana's ever had. I jokingly tell people, and I will again today is day 125 of my acting governorship of Louisiana, as our governor ventures into South Carolina and Iowa and New Hampshire, and by the way of the Constitution, the lieutenant governor is the acting governor. So it's been 125 days thus far this year. I intend to be an accessible governor, traveling around the state, keeping office hours in the major cities of this state on a limited basis, and not a rented office or a new construction, but an existing state office to let the people have the governor come to them and be able to see them in their own communities instead of having to trek to Baton Rouge. I'll be accessible to the press. I was the only candidate who went to the legislature this session and encouraged the legislature to pass the legislation dealing with transparency in the governor's office and eliminating the deliberative process exclusion that had been abused during this administration. We face a lot of challenges in this state. There's no question about that, and it begins with the state budget. It begins with having somebody who understands that budget, who has dealt with it, as I did for 4 years as vice chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. So 8 years I balanced state budgets in both good times and bad. And we all know we've got serious budget challenges right now, and I think we'll have a budget challenge before the end of this fiscal year. And shortly after inauguration, we'll be in a special session, no doubt, to try and address budget problems from this year. And then we'll start thinking about long-term what we do. And you in the business community need to recognize, I think, that we need to make some fundamental changes in the way Louisiana's tax structure exists right now. I want to lower personal income tax rates. I want to lower corporate income tax rates. And I want want to eliminate a number of exclusions and exceptions and credits that are on the books right now. We have too many. It makes it confusing. It favors some people and not others, and I think we need to flatten those rates and make it fair and more certain for Louisiana. I think long-term, that's going to be a very productive thing for our state. As I travel around and talk to people, the three things I hear most in terms of businesses wanting to come to Louisiana, it starts with our infrastructure. That's the main thing that people are concerned about. Our education system, and actually our quality of life is a third thing that's mentioned. As Lieutenant Governor, I've certainly addressed that quality of life issue in running the Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism, not hiring the highest paid person in that department, but running the department myself. That's the way you lead. You lead by example, and you start cutting at the very top, and that's what we did. And it's resulted in 3 successive record-breaking years of tourism, bringing more people to Louisiana than ever before, leaving behind more tax dollars than ever before. I'm going to bring that same energy level and that same leadership style to the governor's mansion, and I look forward to the challenges we face. I think challenges bring us opportunities, and this is an opportunity that I don't want to see Louisiana squander. I want to see it seize, and that's what I intend to do, and I thank you for giving us the opportunity to visit today.
Thank you, Jay. Now I'd like to invite U.S. Senator David Vitter to give his opening remarks. David is a bold conservative reformer who fights to solve Louisiana's most difficult challenges with common sense. He's worked hard to truly represent the people of Louisiana, has held more than 375 town meetings in each parish of the state, as well as 180 teleconference town halls. David also declined to join the congressional retirement system. He's fighting to have Congress live under the same rules created by the Affordable Care Act as everyone else, and has declined health care subsidies provided to members of Congress. After serving as a conservative representative in the Louisiana State House, David was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He was later elected to the U.S. Senate in 2004 and overwhelmingly reelected in 2010. David and his wife, Wendy, have 4 children and live in Metairie. Please join me in welcoming David Vitter. David, thank you.
Thank you, Chuck and Jim and all of you for hosting this really important discussion. It is a very important discussion, this specific topic, because I believe it's one of the greatest challenges we face as a state in terms of dramatically improving our business climate and dramatically expanding job and other opportunities for our young people. Jim mentioned the statistics. By any measure, literally any measure, Louisiana is a judicial hellhole. We are at the worst end of the list in terms of abusive lawsuits that cost Louisiana citizens money and jobs, and we need to do something about it. Now, this isn't some esoteric issue that just affects big businesses or just affects lawyers. It affects every citizen in our state. People estimate that it essentially levies a tax, a frivolous litigation tax of about $10,000 on every family of 4. It puts enormous burden on small business in particular, because experts have done independent studies and have said about 81% of the cost of that frivolous litigation is borne by small business, not mega business. And in Louisiana, the most obvious way it impacts all of us are insurance rates. We pay some of the highest insurance rates in the country, about $7,300 a year for all sorts of insurance combined, and about $2,300 a year on average for car insurance alone. And the single biggest factor that drives that is frivolous litigation and that sort of litigation climate. Because of that, I'm going to do something about it. I set out early in this campaign to compile ideas about how to lead a reform effort of our court system and litigation climate. Went around the state collecting great ideas in that category. And that was translated in terms of detailed proposals and a plan. Our entire plan that touches all of our major challenges in the state is at davidvitter.com, and it has specifics, detailed written specifics on lawsuit reform. I'm the only candidate to do that. I went further and invited leaders from Texas who have led their lawsuit reform effort starting in 1994 to come visit Louisiana, sit with a group of statewide leaders and explain their experience and how they were successful and what they learned along the way. We had a meeting in New Orleans that they attended last August. It was very instructive. I've compiled a working group to continue to work on these reform efforts, and it is a centerpiece of my strategy to dramatically improve our business climate in Louisiana. But don't take my word for it. Don't take the fact that I'm the only candidate with specifics in writing in our plan. Perhaps the most telling evidence of all of this is that the trial lawyers have organized because of this and are literally spending $4 million to attack me in this campaign. So take their word for it. That's the most compelling evidence. Meanwhile, they say they can accept any of the other candidates. That trial lawyer pack that's spending $4 million against me is actively supporting all three of my major candidates on their website. Trial lawyers are actively giving to all of the other campaigns, including about a quarter of $250,000 to Lieutenant Governor Darden. Gumbo PAC, which is 85% funded by trial lawyers, is actively supporting his campaign effort through his super PAC. So perhaps that's the most compelling evidence of who will do something about this moving forward and who won't. And I look forward to getting into the details of exactly the reforms we need to promote pursuant to your questions. So thank you.
Senator, actually, that segues nicely into the first question, and you are have the first response. Civil litigation remains the single largest impediment to economic development in Louisiana, with many companies paying more on tort claims in Louisiana than in any other state in the country. What are your priorities for addressing excessive litigation in Louisiana, and what actions will you take as governor to improve the state's legal climate? Senator Bitter, 3 minutes.
Sure. Thank you, Chuck. Well, again, this is a very real issue. By any metric, we're at the top of the bad list and the bottom of any good list in terms of the litigation environment. And again, as I said before, this isn't some esoteric issue that just impacts lawyers or just impacts big business. It impacts every citizen in the state of Louisiana. It puts a hidden tax on them through consumer goods. It drives up our insurance rates to be among the very most expensive in the country. And it has good jobs and good companies, in many cases, fleeing the state. So we need to do better. And I'm the only candidate with a specific, detailed agenda of doing that. Some of the high points. I think we should get rid of the jury trial threshold completely. I think we're going to talk about that in a future question. We have the highest threshold in the nation by far. All of the arguments that were presented decades ago to support that, I think, have been disproved since then. And I think there are numerous studies, including one done just last year, that show there's no relation between having this high jury trial threshold and having our court system operate efficiently. There's no relation whatsoever. Louisiana is the 7th highest in the nation in terms of the number of judges we have per capita. And for every judge we only have one jury trial per judge per year. So we need to lower that jury trial threshold. I would fight to lower it to 0, which is the rule in the huge majority of states. We need other reforms to prevent venue shopping and judge shopping. That's a very common practice that leads to all sorts of abuse in Louisiana. We need to prevent lawyers from bundling huge amounts of campaign money to judicial candidates and thereby gaining enormous undue influence. So these and other specific proposals are outlined in our plan. Again, all of that is at davidvitter.com.
Thank you, Senator. Lieutenant Governor?
It's certainly news to me that the trial lawyers are spending all sorts of money helping my super PAC, which I think raised about a total of $200,000, and that was it, and hadn't done anything else. So that's not exactly an accurate representation of what's going on. I don't think there's any question that you can point to some tremendous successes in Louisiana on the economic development front. I make that point because businesses are coming to Louisiana, and they're not being dissuaded from coming to Louisiana for any particular purpose. Nonetheless, there's clearly an issue regarding litigation in Louisiana, and I think the specific questions that you're going to pose to us today are addressing the highlights of what this group believes needs to be done in Louisiana. I think one of the things that's been omitted from that discussion is the need to make certain that contributions to judicial campaigns are made public. This will be an interesting separation of powers argument, but it's an argument that I think we should have. I believe that contributions to political campaigns, no matter what the office may be, ought to be fully disclosed and made known to the public. I'll take this opportunity to fuss a little bit at the press who are represented today, because we have very good campaign finance laws in Louisiana that require timely disclosure of every contribution, even more timely as you draw closer to the campaign. But the old days of the press publishing who contributes to a campaign seem to be over. You don't see any detailed presentation like that or any analysis of what exactly trial lawyers are giving to whom, what is business giving to whom, what are particular special interests giving to particular candidates, who is it that's contributing literally millions of dollars to super PACs in order to have their views presented to attack other candidates and sometimes to support candidates. I think that's one of the real problems that's missing right now as we talk about this problem of litigation, is the fact that the public doesn't get a chance to really know who is making contributions specifically in a way that is not in the context of a paid political ad. And I think that ought to change, and I think we ought to have that legislative debate. If the courts said a while back that they were going to take care of policing themselves and requiring this disclosure, and that hasn't really happened yet, and I think it should. I will also make the observation that I think you won't see any campaign finance laws in the next 2 to 3 years in America. With the decisions that have come down allowing the huge amounts of money to be given to super PACs, and Senator Vitter has received huge amounts of money through his super PAC and transferred some of his money raised as a senatorial candidate to that super PAC, used to attack me and others. Scott Angel's super PAC has $1,250,000 from one contributor. People ought to know who that is and why that's happening, and I think there needs to be a lot more discussion about that. And I say that we won't have any campaign finance laws in the near future because if it's a violation of free speech for someone to not be able to give an unlimited amount of money to a super PAC, why is it not a violation of free speech for a Louisianian not to be able to give $6,000 instead of $5,000 to a gubernatorial candidate? That's where I think we're headed in this state, and in this country. I'm not sure that's good for anybody. It certainly will enable the businesses represented today to raise their dollars and contribute, and the trial bar to raise significant dollars and contribute huge amounts of money, and the individual contributor won't matter much anymore, I would suggest to you. So that's a frustration, I think, that is coming for America and for Louisiana. But I think the focus needs to be on making sure that judicial candidates and judges disclose who is contributing to their campaign publicly. And that's not one of the questions asked today, but it's one of the things that I believe ought to be part of Louisiana's campaign finance laws.
Thank you, Jay. As governor, would you support or oppose legislation to establish proper venue and discourage forum shopping in civil litigation by requiring plaintiffs to file cases in the jurisdiction where the alleged injury occurred, specifically where the substantial part of the injury occurred?
Yes.
Lieutenant Governor Darden, you're first, and I'd ask both of you, as much as we can, try to keep these to 3 minutes so we can try to get through all these.
If
Thank
you
you.
kind of give us a little signal when we hit 3 minutes, that would be a big
I'll
help.
do that.
We're used to seeing somebody waving or holding up signs when we're getting to that limit. And, we start making arguments till you get carried away. Yes, I would support.
We're all lawyers.
I understand. That's why I want you to keep us on time. I would support that legislation. I do think there is a considerable amount of forum shopping that goes on in Louisiana, and I think it appropriate to allow a plaintiff to file suit in whatever venue where he resides. That is clearly a part of Louisiana law, and I think the venue to bring defendants to answer for their alleged wrongdoings ought to be in a place where the substantial injury has occurred. And I don't think our laws enable us to limit it that way right now, and I would support such efforts, and I hope such legislation will be brought forward. I think it's an appropriate way to make sure that that there is not the perception and the reality that people go to particular jurisdictions that they believe will be more favorable, to find judges who they believe will be more favorable. And I don't think it's any secret that there are a lot of cases filed in CDC and Orleans Parish, because that's where plaintiffs perceive they are going to get better results than if they were in some other jurisdiction. And I mention that because I think that's what has been borne out by a lot of case law and a lot of discussions I see and I hear among lawyers.
Thank you. Senator Bitter.
Well, I strongly support that proposal, and I won't simply hope it's brought forward. As governor, I will bring it forward in my first term. It's one of the crucial litigation reforms, lawsuit abuse reforms that we need in Louisiana. We are ranked 47th, near last, in terms of having meaningful venue requirements. What does that mean? It means lawyers can shop for favorable judges. That's what it means. They can go much more easily to judges they helped elect, that they bundle huge amounts of money for and help elect. That's undue influence, and that leads to a very uneven playing field and a lot of abuse in the court system. So I will help not only support that sort of reform, I will introduce it and help lead that effort. Let me say, I also agree with many of Jay's comments about outside groups and attack ads. And I'm quick to agree because I'm the biggest target of those attacks in this race by far. And again, the biggest group involved in that is a group of trial lawyers, the Louisiana Water Coalition PAC. They're literally spending millions of dollars against me alone, and they're actively promoting Jay and Scott Angel and John Bell Edwards on their website. Let me clarify, since Jay brought it up, Gumbo PAC, that's a separate special interest liberal PAC, 85% funded by trial lawyers. They are directly contributing to Jay's campaign effort through his super PAC and giving them what's called opposition research. So there's plenty of that going on. Unfortunately, most of it's directed at me about these important issues. But that's all right. We're going to fight through this. We're going to prevail, and then we're going to change Louisiana for the better.
Senator Vedder, this goes to you as well in rotation. As governor, would you support or oppose legislation to require plaintiffs in asbestos suits to file trust claims before proceeding to trial? This simple change would discourage fraud and prevent abusive double dipping, which ultimately preserves money for individuals who are truly injured.
Chuck, I would support that because we need to do it to prevent double dipping, as you noted, and to protect victims who are later on in line. In some cases, the fund, the bankrupt company goes out of existence, and those folks are left holding the bag with real injury and with no recovery. So I would strongly support that. Again, we're talking about individuals and their lawyers getting a double recovery for one injury. We're not talking about limiting their access to the courts. We're not talking about limiting their access to get full recovery for, in some cases, multiple injuries at multiple sites, but a double recovery for the same injury in the same circumstances in the same site. That's wrong, it's fraudulent, and it impacts victims further on in line, injured parties, and sometimes the limited pool of money, for instance, in the context of a bankruptcy, dries up, and those other truly injured parties get no recovery. And that's certainly wrong too. So I would support that reform.
I'd want to see the legislation.
I'm sorry, excuse me.
I would want to see this legislation before I tell you unequivocally we would do that. I think this is a significant problem. But I also recognize that plaintiffs may be entitled to recovery from both the trust as well as a defendant that is not part of the trust. So I think we have to think in terms of a procedural mechanism through discovery that may make that information available so that the court can determine if a stay ought to be granted in a lawsuit that's pending in a district court in Louisiana or a federal court in Louisiana, so that the plaintiff would be required to acknowledge whether they have a trust claim. Those trust claims would be brought against companies who have gone bankrupt, created this huge trust fund that plaintiffs can make a claim against. But I think it is correct that you have an unfair situation if an individual can proceed to trial in a state court and get a judgment without a jury knowing that they may also have an avenue of relief through that trust. So I think there has to be a procedural mechanism that would make certain that that is disclosed, and a judge can make a determination if there ought to be a stay of the trial court proceeding while a claim is filed with the trust and a determination made whether there ought to be a payment to that individual or not. As we know, these are serious problems that people have, and often you have injured claimants who may not have a lot of time to live. And I don't know that it's a fair situation in a judicial setting to say that we're going to postpone your right to have a trial and a jury of your peers indefinitely. We have to have a timely mechanism that makes certain the jury can be aware of that situation. I think that's the balance that's going to have to be struck, because I think the big problem is you don't want a jury to make a decision without knowing that there may be another avenue of recovery that may be available to that plaintiff. And to the extent that we have the collateral source rule in Louisiana, I think in cases like this, dealing with asbestos cases, that ought to be known by a jury before they make a determination.
Thank you. Pardon me for interrupting you. Decades of litigation over the alleged contamination of the legacy oil field sites have resulted in multi-million-dollar payouts for personal injury trial lawyers and their clients, but very few environmental cleanups for Louisiana. Do you support or oppose legislation to improve the regulatory process for handling environmental lawsuits and discourage the filing of frivolous claims by updating regulations that apply to the closure of exploration and production sites? Lieutenant Governor?
Well, obviously, we've been wrangling with this issue for quite some time. It really came into being after I left the legislature and was elected Secretary of State. So I haven't been involved as a legislator directly in the remedies that have been sought to deal with legacy lawsuits. I would say first and foremost, we have to see what the latest incarnation of law is going to bring to try and address frivolous lawsuits and make certain that the environmental damage is repaired first and foremost. That's the main impetus, I think, behind litigation like this, is to make sure that the land is cleaned up. And that's the biggest argument I think I hear from folks who are concerned about the abuse of these lawsuits, is that the environmental cleanup doesn't even get done, and huge damages are awarded, payments are made, and the land still remains in the state it was before the litigation began. So I think first and foremost, we want to make sure that that environmental damage is addressed and repaired when funds are awarded by a court to do just that. I think we're still in the phase of understanding the latest change that took place a couple of years ago in a legislative setting. So I'm anxious to hear what complaints the defendants have about that and what observations the other side has about that. But I want to see if this can work. I'm very much open to other solutions that may need to be done legislatively to specifically address problems that result in huge multi-million-dollar awards from people who had little or nothing to do with the environmental damage, since it was caused decades and decades ago. I do think that is an inhibition to people doing business in Louisiana. I have met with and heard it from a number of defendants and folks in the industry who have to deal with this problem. And I know it remains a major concern, even though there has been a purported compromise that was reached in the legislature a couple of years ago. So I am open to additional legislation that would further clear up and help clean up our land.
Senator Vitter?
Yes, well, I wasn't in the legislature when this issue arose either, but I was still actively involved from a short distance, actively pushing for reforms to address this abuse, because it is outright abuse and it has driven good jobs and good energy activity out of our state. That was in 2012. The governor didn't want to bring it up. His DNR Secretary, Scott Angel, who's obviously running in our race right now, didn't want to bring it up. I was part of an outside group of leaders who forced the issue on the legislature, who highlighted it, who brought it up, who explained how detrimental these abusive legacy lawsuits were to our economy, particularly in the energy sector, and we forced action. Now, what was forced, the compromise that was reached, has been diluted and in some cases misinterpreted by the courts. So we still have important work to do. And I won't wait to see how this sifts out. I will act, because it's clear to me right now as we speak that we need further action to resolve this significant area of real lawsuit abuse. Give you one example about what impact it has on our economy. About 8 months ago, I had a meeting with a guy named Jeff Hildebrand. He's the head of Hillcore, a major energy company. And Hillcore right today, as we speak, is the single biggest energy taxpayer to the state of Louisiana because of all of their activity on land and on the shelf. The majors, of course, have greater activity, but they're in federal deep water, so they're not as significant energy taxpayers to the state of Louisiana. He said, Senator Vitter, I can paint the picture pretty simply for you. We have oil and gas activity around the country, to some extent around the world. We're extremely careful. We take our environmental and safety and health responsibility very seriously. We're not cavalier in any way, and we still have 75 lawsuits worldwide filed against us, and 70 are in Louisiana. And the huge majority of those are part of this legacy lawsuit cottage industry. And that's what it is, a trial lawyer cottage industry built on abuse, with awards from judges or juries that have no relation to anything like the fair market value of the land in pristine condition, and little to no requirement that the award be used to clean the land. We have to change that. We made a step forward starting in 2012, but it's been watered down through various court decisions. We have to go further, and I'll certainly lead that effort.
During the legislative process, the legislature often adds language to new bills declaring it is not the intent of this legislature to create a new private cause of action. This language sends a clear signal to the courts of their legislative intent. However, there are occasions in which legislation is silent on this issue or less than clear, and so the courts are left to decide whether or not the new legislation intended to create a new private cause of action. Some may refer to this practice as legislating from the bench. Will you support legislation to clarify that the legislature does not intend to create a new private cause of action in any legislation it passes, unless the legislature clearly expresses its intent to create a new private cause of action in the specific legislative act? Senator Vitter?
Chuck, I would support that language. I think that should be the general rule of interpretation, because unless the legislature lays out something clearly, I don't think something should be implied, something as significant as a brand new legal cause of action, when the legislature did not lay that out in clear terms. So I think that should be the general rule of interpretation. But in the political context of a bunch of courts, with trial lawyers having undue influence with those judges, pushing to constantly expand the boundaries, constantly expand causes of action and lawsuit opportunities, that's not how it's handled. It's how it should be handled, and therefore I would support that sort of language and legislation to clarify that.
Lieutenant Governor Gordon?
No, I wouldn't support that. Now, I'll tell you why. Whether or not it is in the intent to create a new private cause of action is something that ought to be subject to legislative debate. That is a legislative issue. And I think in cases where there is not an intent to create a new private cause of action, that should be something that the legislature debates and the legislature decides. It's similar to the discussions that take place in the legislature about whether something is procedural or substantive. That has always been a point of discussion in legislative debates. I remember many debates about that particular particular issue during my 15 years as a senator. And I think that that is the appropriate forum to have that debate. And if a legislative intent is not to create a cause of action, it ought to be so stated in the law, I believe, instead of just a presumption because that language is absent. That way the debate will be clear in the legislature as to what the intent is. I think the legislature, and I served in that body for 15 years, has an obligation to make sure it tells courts what it intends to do. And that way the debate takes place in the forum that I think is appropriate and not in an implied situation to be presented to the courts.
On the jury trial threshold issue that we've referred to a bit before, Louisiana is the only state that requires individual claims reach $50,000 before allowing a jury trial. Do you support or oppose legislation to eliminate or reduce the jury trial threshold? Lieutenant Governor, you're first.
I don't remember, honestly, how many times I filed this bill, but I know it was several times while I was in the Louisiana State Senate to reduce the jury trial threshold from 50 to 25, and I support doing that. I do not support taking the jury trial threshold down to 0. I think the appropriate middle ground is going from 50 to 25, but I wholeheartedly agree and have seen in my practice, particularly in a mediation context, the impact of the $50,000 jury threshold and what it does to forcing defendants to pay more than the case is really worth to avoid having a plaintiff waive a jury trial, present it to a friendly judge who is going to make an award that is really beyond the scope of what is justified by the facts of the case. So I've been trying to do this dating back to my days in the Louisiana State Senate, and I have told those who are advocating taking the jury threshold to 0, as well as those in the plaintiff bar, that I would support going to 25, consistent with what I did during all my days in the legislature. You've seen a lot of opposition to this legislatively, actually by judges who are concerned about having to have more jury trials, and who, particularly in rural areas, who believe it will cause a problem because they have such difficulty seating juries anyway when they have criminal and civil jurisdiction at the same time. And they have expressed a concern about being able to get enough people to serve on juries if suddenly you have an influx of jury trials at the 0 threshold. That's why I don't think it should go quite that low. But I think this would be a very significant step for Louisiana to take to send a clear message that we are not going to allow cases that are really not worth that much become suddenly worth that much because of the threat to waive a jury trial, take it to a judge. I think that's the appropriate middle ground, and I support going to 25,000.
Senator Vetter.
I support going to 0, which is what the great majority of states, the rule is in their states. 36 states have no jury trial threshold. Only 14 states have any threshold. Louisiana has the highest by far. The next highest after us is Maryland at 15, and so 25 would still be the highest by far in the country. If we have a threshold, say, at 25, that is still free reign for small car accident cases to go to a judge and for him to basically force a settlement way above the actual value of that case. So I think where it really hits people's pocketbooks in terms of car insurance, insurance rates in general, cost of consumer goods and services, moving from 50 to 25 would not have a major impact. We need to move much, much lower. Again, only 14 states have any limit. We're at 50, Maryland is 15. 8 of those 14 states have a limit of $1,500 or less, so virtually no limitation. This is a key reform that's necessary to really break the stranglehold of abusive lawsuits in many of our courts. A lot of arguments were made previously about the need to have courts operate more efficiently. I think there have been several studies more recently across multiple states that disprove those arguments. I do think we can handle it, particularly since we have the 7th highest number of judges per capita in the country. And for every judge in the state, we only have 1 jury trial per year. So I think we can handle that. And actually, what you'll see is far fewer undue lawsuits being filed and litigated versus clogging up the courts, because the high jury trial threshold and the ability for lawyers in many cases to get undue settlements actually floods the courts with lawsuits that would be thinned out if we made that reform.
Thank you, gentlemen. That concludes our question and answer segment today. We're actually running a little bit early. So at this time, I would invite each of our candidates to give brief closing remarks, but you don't necessarily have to confine yourself to the 3 minutes we talked about. Beginning with you, David.
Great. Well, again, thank you all for this important discussion. More importantly, thanks for the work that you do for lawsuit reform and to move us forward in terms of our economy and opportunities for all of us in Louisiana. This is a really important topic. It's often overlooked. It's often not the focus of debate, but it is very important because, again, it affects all of our lives. It's about very high insurance rates in Louisiana. It's about good companies and good jobs, in many cases, fleeing the state. In the energy sector, I think it's the single most negative factor after the current low price of oil. It's about a tax embedded in the cost of consumer goods that we buy every day. So it goes directly to our quality of life. That's why we need somebody who's going to take up the fight and push these reforms. And look, make no mistake about it, this is not going to be an easy fight. There are big political forces lined up, including in this election, to stand at the door and block any of this sort of reform effort. I'm the only candidate with the platform and the record to take this on. I will take it on because it's important for our moving the state forward, for creating the sort of opportunities we all want for our kids, for improving the business climate, which is so necessary if we're going to grow great jobs here. Of course, there are other challenges we need to meet. Most immediately, the budget crisis, and it is a crisis, and I'll immediately call a special session to take that on very early next year. Transportation infrastructure, that has become a bottleneck, pun intended, to growing good jobs in the state. Education, that's our biggest long-term challenge by far, both pre-K through 12 and higher ed. And as part of that, adequate skills training. We do have some great jobs coming here, particularly in the industrial sector. We don't have enough skilled workers, Louisianians, to fill those jobs. So I'll address those other key challenges as well. And in all of these areas, we have detailed, specific proposals in our plan, Together Louisiana Strong. All of that is at davidvitter.com. Thanks again for hosting us, and I would certainly be honored to earn your support and your vote, either in early voting right now or on Saturday, October 24th. Great to be with you.
Thank you, Senator. Lieutenant Governor.
I, too, want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to discuss this very important issue and for all of you being here today. I think it would be news to John Bell Edwards, who's not here, that the trial bar may be supporting me, because that certainly is not the case based upon the level of contributions that are being made. I like to ascribe to Ronald Reagan's very famous saying about his contributors. They subscribe to his agenda. He doesn't subscribe to theirs, and that's exactly what I would say to you. I don't deny the fact that I have friends in the legal industry, in the legal business, who are contributing to my campaign, but they certainly don't make up the bulk of contributions that I receive, as you were perhaps led to believe by Senator Vitter, which gives me the opportunity to use this forum as an opportunity to respond to some of the lies that you're hearing from Senator Vitter and from the massive super PAC that he has accumulated with supporters of his from his responsibilities in Washington coming to Louisiana and attempting to sway our position. I've been in public life for more than 25 years without any hint of impropriety at all or scandal. Yet I see myself being bombarded on the airways by Senator Vitter's campaign and by the super PAC. He is feeling attacked by these gumbo PACs. He's the one who is attacking. I am the attackee. And let me clear up a couple of things for you, specifically related to some ads that you've seen on TV. Ronald Reagan and I share the same birthday, but I can assure you that the trips that I made overseas were a bashless birthday. I made those trips as part of my responsibilities as lieutenant governor. And let me say very clearly to you that I paid for my wife to accompany me on those trips. You didn't. All the business people and tourism officials who accompanied us on that trip did so because they knew we were promoting Louisiana and bringing business and bringing tourism back to Louisiana. One of the trips happened to occur on my birthday, which is February 6th, because our liaisons in Germany and Great Britain said, you need to be here right now in the dead of winter because travel decisions for the spring and summer are being made right now. That's why we went when we went. Those trips overseas, two of them that cost a total of $11,000, not $34,000. That was the expense for me to go two places. Increased international visitation in Louisiana by 26%, the largest percentage increase in America. It was my responsibility to promote Louisiana, to go after those international visitors who stay longer and spend more money than anybody, and we've done it. For the first time ever, we hosted the Guild of British Travel Writers. We've got the largest tourism event coming to Louisiana in 2016 in the world. We've had 3 record-breaking years of tourism in a row, and I'm proud of that record. And in no way was it any kind of abuse of taxpayer money, as you're led to believe in the commercials. And the same holds true for my $700 car allowance, which pays for my 2008 Highlander, not a Porsche. I had a choice of getting a new state car and having you pay for all the gas, or taking a $700 car allowance. I took the allowance because it was more beneficial to the taxpayers. I'm accused of voting myself health care for life. I wasn't a member of the group benefits system when that vote was taken, and I and others urged Kathleen Blanco to veto the bill. You're seeing an awful lot of lies on TV, and this decision for who you vote for and who ought to be the leader of this state shouldn't be driven by that kind of abuse from someone who has millions and millions of dollars to try and influence the state. Louisiana is not going to be bought. Senator, she's not for sale. And I ask you when you go vote to consider my record of public service to you over 25 plus years, and who is the best person not to divide this state, but to bring this state together, do what's in the best interest of the people of Louisiana, address our budget problems, address our infrastructure problems, promote economic development, and promote this state. And I've proven to you that I can do it during my entire career in public service, and I ask you for your vote, and I ask you for your support, and I look forward to working with you as we address the issues that we discussed today. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. We greatly appreciate you for taking the time to join us today and for sharing your views on lawsuit reform. And that concludes our forum. Thank you all very much for attending.
I've always advocated reducing the jury trial threshold. I attempted to do that while I was in the state Senate unsuccessfully, and it seems to have gained a little life over the course of the past couple of years. And I would like to see the jury trial threshold reduced to $25,000. That's the main thing I think that can be done in the state right now to put a better spin on the judicial climate in Louisiana.
I think we need to lower the jury trial threshold. I think the right to a trial by jury is a fundamental right. Everybody should have that right, and we shouldn't be hindered in that by an artificial threshold. We should also stop the corruption and cronyism, quite frankly, that goes on in lawsuit abuse. Too many lawyers bundle huge contributions for judicial candidates. That provides undue influence. There's too much court shopping and judge shopping, and we need better rules so that a lawsuit goes to a proper court depending on where the alleged injury takes place.
Unfortunately, we've been ranked consistently on the bottom of numerous surveys in recent years. For example, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Institute for Legal Reform recently ranked Louisiana 49th out of all 50 states. Around the same time, the Center for Legal Integrity, which is a national watchdog organization, gave us an F for judicial accountability, while the American Tort Reform Association has ranked Louisiana as a judicial hellhole for 5 years running. So it's important that we take notice of these assessments. What's more important is that the vast majority of Louisiana voters agree with these assessments. A poll we conducted last year found 76% of Louisiana voters believe and support legislation to improve the state's legal climate.
What would your organization like to see happen in the next term of the legislature?
Sure. We're hosting this gubernatorial forum today and reaching out to legislative candidates all across the state. And our hope is that to raise awareness about the need for legal reform in Louisiana, and encourage candidates to look at these issues very seriously and to make them a priority in 2016.
If people have questions like more information, what should they do?
They can visit our website, www.law.org, LLAW.org, and they can also visit the coalitionforcommonsense.com.